Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Somm TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. On today's episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about harvest and kind of how it went this year, its impact, how the weather was, and how that's going to affect prices on wine for the next, little bit with this vintage of 24. And next week on Somm TV, we're going to be airing some of the great winemakers in Napa Valley got together to talk about the 2024 vintage, and we're going to check in with them and see how that went. So stay tuned to Somm TV. If you're not a subscriber, obviously, go to sommtv.com and subscribe. We have all new episodes airing there right now, including Master Sommelier Jay Fletcher opening up some Burgundies from the 30s, talking about those wines. We have a closer look at Cornas, a new episode on one of the great regions to make a pure expression of Syrah. And we also have a closer look at Barbaresco. So if you want to go to Northern Italy and learn about the history, food pairings, and everything about one of the great red wines of that area, go to sommtv.com. Thanks for joining me, gentlemen. Anthony Zhang over from VinoVest and our producer, John Adams from Wild Sun Wine up in Oregon. We're going to talk a bit about harvest and kind of how it went this year. Anthony, you were just in France, which I imagine was, I hope you gained some weight while you were there, having a good time in France.
It's hard not to.
Yeah.
The diet there is quite heavy.
Yeah, especially in Burgundy, man. I can't behave when it comes to food there, but did you work harvest at all, or were you just there observing?
We were there right before harvest. So I think the dates that we were there, a little bit over a week, we were probably 3 to 5 days away from the actual harvest for Côte de Beaune and Côte de Nuits.
Right. That's fantastic. So why don't you start off, and John, we'll talk a little bit about Oregon's harvest. You got done harvesting yourself with wine up there, but let's talk about Bordeaux and Burgundy. What did this year look like? How'd it go?
Yeah, so I think we'll split it on the whites and the reds, right? So
sure.
Looking at Côte de Beaune for the whites, quality, a lot of people were really, really happy with. Even though it was a very rainy season in the entire region, Chardonnay just is a lot more hardy than Pinot Noir, especially when it comes to mildew. So with mildew being the biggest issue that the producers faced, the whites fared a lot better. Yields were down, but not exceptionally down. So I'd say most producers were reporting maybe 15 to 25% decrease in volume compared to 2023. But heading to Côte de Nuits, especially in some of the top appellations like Gevrey and Beaune, that's where the damage hit the hardest. Top producers like Bizot and Mounier-Gibourg, Dujac, they're reporting either 50, 60, even 70% lower yields due to a lot of the issues that they were having earlier in the season.
That's insane. 50 to 70% lower yields in places where those are some of the top wines in the world. I can't even fathom what that means for supply and demand.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to these top, Grand and Premier Crus, where many of these producers, they only have, a few rows, right? And if you're a few rows, which for most years is barely enough to make a barrel, you can't even make that barrel this year. A lot of them are actually thinking about either tossing it out completely or declassifying it or lower classifying it. So, for example, a Grand Cru to a Vosne Romanée Premier Cru and not designating the vineyard, or downgrading a Premier Cru down to a village level just to be able to get enough volumes to do the press.
Man, I'll tell you, if you were had a little insider baseball, you could get some good wine for a good price if you know which ones those are. Jesus.
Yeah.
That is,
I think I may have a few bets on that insider baseball.
I'm sure you do. So I want to talk for a second. Was it raining during harvest? I mean, did they literally get the worst case scenario where they were dealing with water in the bins kind of thing?
So luckily there was no rain during harvest. Harvest started pretty early. I think it was for most folks between the 11th and the 15th of September. And those were the last sunny days. There was a little bit of rain before harvest and some right after, but we were able to get 3 to 5 days of decent weather where it wasn't pouring for more than, I'd say, an hour or so.
John, I want to ask, from a mildew standpoint, you're a winemaker, you are the producer of this podcast, do all the audio here, but you are actually I'm not sure what you spend more time on, making wine or making films or such. I want you to give everybody sort of an idea of what he means when he says mildew affecting these grapes.
So the main two mildews that affect wine grapes are typically powdery mildew and in some places downy mildew. On the West Coast, we don't usually have to deal with downy mildew. It's all powdery mildew. But if you live in a region where there's warm, wet, humid summers, places like Bordeaux, the eastern parts of the United States, typically they will have downy mildew issues.
And that's something that affects the grapes themselves, right? And what's it look like?
It's like a whitish, almost like a furry or powdery, I guess you could say, type of mildew. It usually forms on the bottom side of the leaves first, and then eventually spreads to the clusters. Powdery mildew also infects all kinds of vegetables in your garden as well. If you've ever grown cucumbers and you notice there's powdery film on your leaves or your fruit or vegetables, that's the same type of powdery mildew that infects European grapevines. And then if you don't get on top of it quickly with whatever fungicides you happen to be using, it will eventually grow to the clusters. And that's when you have a big problem.
How do you treat it? What are we spraying on these vines? Because this is going to lead right into my next question for Anthony.
If you're an organic program, you're limited in what you can use. Typically, people will use sulfur, elemental sulfur, which is sprayed on the canopy and on the grapes themselves, and that controls the spores. Some places use copper. There's mineral oils you can use. There's bacterial-based fungicides. There's all kinds of stuff you can use in an organic program. But then you have inorganic methods, and there are tons of different kinds of inorganic fungicides that will control mildews. And they're very effective, but if you're an organic farmer, you can't use inorganic products.
So as we know, places like Bordeaux and Burgundy are increasingly much more biodynamic and organic, especially some of these top guys.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Anthony, did you see people having to go, oh crap? I mean, they're certified, but in order to save their vines, they do it. Anything going on there with having to treat their vines with different chemicals instead of what they wanted to?
Yeah, I think this year especially, it was a big debate. Especially to become organic, it takes many years, right? You usually need to do it over a 3 to 5 year process. So especially for producers who say in 2022, 2023, we're on the way to getting their organic certification, and this is their last year, having to deal with the choice of losing over 50% of your crop or doing something about it and then potentially having to start over again for the next 3 years if you wanted to continue that pursuit of organic certification. It caused a lot of discussion. And I think, especially at the high end, that's why you don't see a lot of these producers officially obtaining that organic certification, even though, everything else in the vineyard, they do it sustainably, right? They're practicing these sustainable and regenerative farming practices, but and some of them are even more strict than what the organic organizations call for, but they just don't like to really label themselves that way because they'd like to have the flexibility on a year like this, right? If sulfur and copper aren't cutting it, or it's just too expensive, which many of them have expressed, right? What do you do next, right? If you're losing that much of your crop, it's a big livelihood issue too.
I will also say that typically throughout the growing season, you're rotating the fungicides that you're using because the efficacy of those fungicides decreases drastically the more you use them in succession. So that's why people will rotate in different fungicides every other spray.
God, it just seems like such a pickle to be in when you literally have to pivot.
It's a real pain in the ass.
If you're using one of these inorganic chemicals to fight, how long before you can be recertified? Do you know at all?
I think it's a 3-year process to go from conventional to organic certification in the US, at least. I don't know about Europe.
Yeah, the year is gone, at least the year that you use it, and then you can restart the next harvest, right? So you're just basically back to square one, depending on how far you were in the first place.
So going back to Burgundy and the harvest, I think since you were in Burgundy, I want to set a sort of focus there, and then we'll talk a little bit, John, about your harvest up in Oregon. How did the harvest? Where was it good? I know there's a lot of issues in regards to hail and things like that. Any places where it just shined and it worked and everything was okay? Yeah,
I think looking at Côte de Beaune, I'd say the the positive feedback I've heard, mainly in Meursault and Chassagne-Montrachet. Haven't heard too much feedback outside of those two appellations on people being really, really pleased with the quality. And then with the reds, they've only just been pressed. A lot of them are struggling with just having acidity being a little bit too high and not enough balance. So they're really struggling with the sort of alcohol level and the concentration of the vintage, especially in the villages of Beaune and Gevrey-Chambertin, as I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. So it's gonna look really tough for the reds, both from a volume and from a quality standpoint. They're looking a lot lighter than usual compared to 2022 and 2023, and are looking closer to like a 2021, 2014, which were both really, really cold vintages.
So how is this going to impact pricing? I mean, if I wanted, is this a vintage I'm going to want to look out for if I'm looking for a bargain, or is this what's this vintage going to look like 2024?
Yeah, it's a tough one because Burgundy's been in a slump these past 2 years, right? We've seen these sky high Burgundy prices of 21, 22. 23 was a little bit of a flat versus slightly down for the releases. And that was what people were expecting, right? Finally, a breather in terms of the price increases. But most of the 23s have not been released. And with these producers knowing that they won't have much 24 to sell, they might actually be having their hands tied and forced to sell the 23s at a higher price, right? So that's going to lead to more unsustainable pricing where the consumer expectations are pretty disjointed from the actual quality.
I'd like a break personally as a drinker.
Me too.
Let's go to Oregon, then we'll talk Bordeaux here. Because I think when we talk harvest and you talk futures, Bordeaux is always the big conversational piece. I mean, they have the whole Premier and all the stuff. So, John, let's go up to Oregon because, growing the same kind of grapes, Pinot and Chardonnay. How did harvest go up there?
Man, harvest was so great this year. We had an amazing
It's always the difference.
vintage.
I love it. In France, they're like, well, we lost our son, our cousin's in the hospital. And then you go to America and it's like, well, I got a new car. It's always so
No, I will say this actually was a pretty magical harvest this year compared to last year. So last year was quite warm in October. I remember harvesting in like early October, late September last year, and it was in the 80s while we were harvesting. And this year, we had a really cold August this year. I think there was like a 2-week period in August where we didn't break 65 degrees at my house, which really slowed things down on the ripening side.
Did you reach Veraison at all? Like, did you actually hit Veraison this year or no?
We eventually made it. Yes. We had a great September, a little bit of rain at the beginning of October, but then it dried out again. And we had like this perfect, mild, kind of like what you would expect, like a classic Willamette Valley vintage, I think, where we got a lot of great hang time. Like we didn't pick our Gamay. Gamay is always late here, but we didn't pick our Gamay until the very last possible moment before the big rains came, and it barely made it to 22 bricks. So
wow.
Gamay is late, but the Pinot was beautiful this year. We're super happy with how everything tastes. I mean, I think like the wines coming off the press this year have been the best that I can remember.
Let's go back to France where they're dying by the hundreds.
Yeah.
No, I mean, no. So Bordeaux is one of these places that I think when I think of people looking at, what's this vintage going to be like, the futures, everything, it's Bordeaux is what I think of. I mean, I know that it's like that for every region, the Rhone Valley, all of it, but Bordeaux really has the attention, I think. How did it go in Bordeaux? Same story as Burgundy, or was it a little different?
Yeah, I was really tough in Bordeaux as well, but I think just because of the surface area that Bordeaux covers, right, and the more of the parcelization approach, right, there's no Grand Cru or Premier Cru vineyard, right, there's only Grand Cru, Premier Classé chateaus. They're able to really, I think, hide it a lot better. So, for example, Chateau Latour, right, they're fully biodynamic, but they also have many parcels that are becoming biodynamic. So they can kind of pick and choose the best parcels to be able to create their first growth blend, right? And then for their second wine, maybe that suffers a little bit more because they don't have, they're just picking the cream of the crop, right? If you do that in Burgundy, the cream of the crop might just be like 3 bottles and you got nothing to sell. So I think the volume is really in favor of the Beaujolais for that. But the same issues, right? Mildew, lots of rain, and struggles with attaining the right alcohol levels. And I think a lot of other people who have tasted are saying, hey, it's lower yields, higher acidity, and they're calling it more of a classic vintage, which means it's less dense, less powerful.
And would you say like less age worthy, or is it not? That's to see later.
That's to see. I mean, sometimes the less highly rated vintages are age even more beautifully, right? Like for example, I had a 2014 Carrera de Lafite, and that was the lowest rated Lafite in the last 15 years, or for the Carrera at least, right? And it was drinking beautifully, right? I think sometimes the wines, especially the Bordeaux wines that are maybe a little bit more low in alcohol, have less of that power and that high scoring, like Robert Parker's sort of attraction. They tend to become a little bit more approachable earlier on, at 10 to 15 years, rather than a lot of these great Bordeauxs are hitting their peak around 25, 30 years, right? So I think at this mark, I kind of prefer those sort of lower scoring vintages at this age, that sort of 8 to 10 year mark.
Sure. I think your perspective is so fascinating because you have to have your pulse on old, new, and release, and futures, release, everything. What are your thoughts? I mean, I'll just ask you flat out, as an investment company, how do you feel about what you saw for the 2024? Is this going to be a vintage you would say buy, stock up on, or is this one that's like you can wait if you have the luxury and buy it if it's determined to be good?
Yeah, I think we're really, really looking at the release prices, right? The 2024s for Bordeaux, the pricing will be released next May. With Burgundy, for example, it might not be released until the following winter or even maybe 2 years later, right? They follow a little bit less of a schedule. So I think you can be very selective here. The quality is not completely apparent. It's not one of the ones like 2019 where in Bordeaux is like, buy everything. Everything's going to be great. You're going to be very happy no matter what you buy. I think there's definitely some traps. Like, it's not just the best names that are going to be showing quality. And the ones that maybe an investor would usually buy year after year, we may need to halt the brakes and say, hey, actually, we don't recommend it this year, or just wait till it's been out in the market for several years because the price may be lower than buying upon release.
Really? Oh, interesting. That's good to know. I need to off mic. I need some of your insider baseball stuff. I think.
No, we're definitely seeing that for both Bordeaux and for Burgundy. Is sometimes the library vintages that are already out in the market are trading at 10, 20% even lower than their release price, which just shows how disjointed the en-primeur system sometimes can be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're trying to go for a bird in the hand, and
exactly. They don't care. They don't care what happens, right? The negociants, they're committed to buying X amount from the chateau, and they need to offload it before next year.
That's right. Yeah, makes total sense. I mean, but it also, going back to Oregon, why this is so fascinating, all these names, especially Burgundy, the Drouin family, and so many more, they're all in Oregon. Now you know why. Oregon is a much more consistent
It's a nice insurance policy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, really. John, how many French families? I know the Drouin family has quite a large.
Yeah, there's Drouin, there's Jadot with Resonance.
Bertrand de Verlaine has his own project up there.
Oh, really?
Nicolas Mayo of Mayo Camuzet has a project up there. There's a few really top names, and of course, a lot of these proprietors in Burgundy have consulted or maybe advised. They've got a very close connection to Oregon.
Turns out it's a pretty good place to grow grapes.
I didn't know this till today. Who knew? It's going to be interesting to see as, weather kind of cycles in and out and changes over the years and what happens. If, France and these areas are going to get better or worse, or what's going to happen. It doesn't seem like it's trending better at the moment, at least when you talk to some of the winemakers. But, I wonder if Oregon and places like Napa and that are going to have their fair share of challenges. Right now, it seems to be pretty even.
I would say that Oregon is entering a sweet spot now, whereas 25, 30 years ago, you may have been on the losing side on a lot of vintages that were really cold, or you had a lot of early rains. And now, in the last 15 years or so, we've been in that sweet spot where we get beautiful fall weather, warm but not too hot into late October, and you get really nice wines out of those years. So we'll see.
Do you have any neighbors selling land, John?
John's like, buy mine. I'm tired of this. Now, are there any, just a quick one for you, Anthony, are there a lot of wineries in Oregon that people are starting to take seriously as an investment?
That's an interesting one, just because I feel like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's been the same discussion on, hey, like, is Oregon going to be the next Burgundy? Mm-hmm. And it's just never really popped out, I think, past the domestic market. Still the brand recognition of, some of the top names like, Domaine Serene, or I guess 00 is probably the only one that's really branched outside of just, just having an American audience. And I think that's because, Richard Herman, he even has a project in Burgundy now.
They make wine in Burgundy.
They make Grand Cru Burgundy, right? Yeah. So I think
they make wine in Corton, don't they? I mean, they're making wine in the sweetest of sweet spots.
They're like Grand Crus only. I have no idea how they source that fruit, but they've got some sweet.
It helps being rich, Anthony. I'm not sure if you know what that's like, but I don't. But we've
hopefully one day we get there, be able to buy some Corton and have a little bottle we can call ours. But yeah, I think just for Oregon, it's still amazing price to quality ratio, right? I feel like it's still under the radar for the global market, kind of like, even say like German Pinot Noirs, right? There's some amazing German Pinots that are in that sort of, 50 to 100 range, which is where I feel a lot of the quality Oregon Pinots are, that it just hasn't really broken into the mainstream. John, What do you think as like someone who's selling wine now?
Well, I'd argue that the Willamette Valley is still quite a young wine region on the global stage. I mean, they've only been growing serious wine grapes here for 50, 60 years. If you look at the evolution of regions over the course of time, Oregon we're not going away,
I think there are wines that are staggering coming out of, my experience is mostly the Willamette like others, but I'm blown away by the wines there. Honestly, it is like, I'm afraid though that the price is going to start rocketing up, and it already kind of is, John, right? I mean, some of these wines, like you mentioned 00, those are setting a precedent. Some of those wines are very expensive for
the Richard Herman Cuvée is like, I think almost $400 a bottle now, right?
It's very pricey. You guys know my thoughts on wine. Should not cost that much. But that being said, if you can get it, do it. Go for it. Bordeaux's been doing it for a long time, so that's not a new thing. Well, I mean, any other thoughts on harvest this year? I mean, obviously, we'll talk more about how it went in Napa, and I'm sure everyone's going to say, perfect. There were fairies, and fairies were flying around. It was wonderful. They were giving out free Reese's cups. But I wonder, how things went in Italy and, Tuscany and these other great regions, which we should cover in future episodes. Anything left to say in regards to the left, right bank, Bordeaux, Burgundy?
Yeah, I think you really have to do your research this year as a consumer and as an investor, right? It's not just the top names that are going to be producing great wines. And even in Burgundy, some of the crus that you may be familiar buying, don't be surprised if you can't get your hands on any, because either A, the quantities are so small, or B, they're declassifying them.
Wow. Well, maybe sometime you'll be nice enough to come on this podcast and talk about how people can get some of this declassified incredible wine. But we'll see. We'll see if you're willing to do that. I see the grin on your face right now. All right. Well, anyways, thank you, boys. I appreciate it very much. And cheers to a good harvest 2024. We'll talk more. I want to thank everybody for listening. We really appreciate that. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to go and give us a good review and a rating wherever you listen to your pods, on Apple or on Spotify. And also go to somtv.com to watch hundreds of hours of the greatest culinary content you can find. Remember, we have 2 new episodes of A Closer Look, Cornas and Barbaresco, airing right now, as well as some bottle stories with Master Sommelier Jay Fletcher. And next week on Som TV, we're going to be airing our vintage report with the Napa winemakers for 2024. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be interesting to see how that vintage pans out. All right, everybody, be safe. Hope you have some great wine for the holidays coming up. Talk soon.